During the 2015 presidential campaign, the demographic electoral strategy of each party seemed fairly obvious and straightforward to me. The Dems' marketing, messaging, nominee, vibes, and aesthetics were all geared towards appealing to women and minority groups, and the Republicans were banking big time on the white vote. Many alleged experts and political pundits were convinced that the Republican strategy was political suicide. They boldly declared that America is simply too diverse in current year for a presidential candidate to alienate all of the major minority groups and coast into the White House simply on the white vote alone. When I became aware of the 100-year historic turnout in the 2015 Republican primaries, I knew that they were wrong and that America's fate was sealed. Hence, why I accurately predicted the election of Donald Trump in 2016, much to the shock of much of my liberal family members who thought it was about as possible as a pig taking flight. While the Democrats' strategy made perfect sense to me and their electoral math seemed to check out, what I didn't really understand, what didn't really make sense to me in that election cycle is why the Democrats fed into the Republican strategy and gave them exactly what they wanted. What I mean is this: the Democratic strategy makes sense on its face, right? Unite women, 50% of the country, with various minority groups in order to defeat the now minority group of white men. Republicans, however, wanted to increase the overall turnout of the only major demographic that they were messaging for, white people, especially white men. In order to do this, they were going to feed powerful and emotionally resonant cultural grievances to galvanize and strengthen that base of support. But where would they get these grievances from? And what would they be? And while reactionaries are certainly no stranger to manufacturing completely artificial culture war issues, unfortunately, the Democrats stood front and center and said, "No need to worry. You don't need to manufacture anything this time. I'll give you everything you could possibly want."
This is for Hillary. Like a small boat on the ocean.
I don't know who created Pokemon Go, but I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out.
Is the point taken, or do I have to say why this campaign messaging was nuclear levels of idiotic? Just because your electoral strategy is based off of women and minorities does not mean you have to actively alienate white men, therein directly feeding into the electoral strategy of your enemy. Duh, obviously. Since the disastrous blowout of Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, largely due to the massive pool of influence wielded by manosphere podcasters and content creators like Joe Rogan, Democrats have been in a panic trying to figure out how to reverse and counter this trend. Part of that panic has been the realization that men, particularly young men, have been moving more and more to the right since the mid-2010s. Gee, I wonder why that is. I wonder what that time frame coincides with. It couldn't possibly be because the Liberal Party and their media allies have been doing anything and everything that they can to alienate young men for a decade. No, it must be because of Joe Rogan. It must be because of social media algorithms. So, because Democratic leadership refuses to ever learn a lesson or self-reflect in an honest manner, they are now spending tens of millions of dollars in order to study how to connect with young men and how to create a Joe Rogan of the left. Putting aside that Joe Rogan used to be the Joe Rogan of the left, and often used to talk about his support of left politics, even endorsing and hosting Bernie Sanders on his show, and also putting aside that, as mentioned previously, during this time the Democratic and media messaging was to alienate men as much as possible. It is basically an oxymoron to ask, how can we create a Joe Rogan of the left? The seeds of the Democratic destruction are already contained within the salvation that they're seeking. It completely demonstrates the fact that Democrats still don't know what the fuck they're doing or what the fuck they're even talking about. They have not even arrived at being able to accurately assess and describe how Joe Rogan's success even happened to begin with, because if they did, they would understand that their goal is completely asinine and impossible, because Joe Rogan was not created. He was a stand-up comedian for decades before ever starting a podcast in the late 2000s. He had years and years of being front and center with young male audiences during UFC broadcasts as the UFC was exploding in popularity. He was grinding out podcast episodes 5 days a week for the better part of a decade before his podcast ever saw any traction leading into the 2016 election season. Love him or hate him, and boy do I hate him, but Joe Rogan's success was completely organic. That type of thing cannot be recreated in a lab by a McKinsey consultant or a DNC focus group. That type of thing is like a unicorn, unbelievably rare, which is why Hillary and the Democrats' decision to alienate Joe Rogan and men during that time, to not message toward them, to not include them in the movement, to not bring them into the fold, was a level of political stupidity and incompetency virtually unmatched in modern politics, never seen before or since. Here, you had a once-in-a-lifetime cultural phenomena of the Joe Rogan experience in the palm of your hand, ready to be absorbed into the Borg and wielded for democratic electoralism, and Democrats and their liberal media allies said, haha, fuck you and fuck off. So young men did, and Joe Rogan did. So with all that said, you can probably understand why headlines and stories like this are giving me an aneurysm and making me want to beat my skull in with a hammer in order to make it stop.
Since Trump scored big with young male voters last election, Democrats are spending $20 million to learn how to speak their language. You heard it, $20 million just to talk to boys. So is this a good idea or a waste of money? What do you think?
In completely unrelated news, 25-year-old white man David Hogg is being forcibly removed from his leadership position in the Democratic National Committee. Sarcasm aside, why are Democrats doing this at the exact same time they're saying they want to win over young men? Because this young man committed wrongthink. Because Democrats are not interested in the ideas and strategies of young men. All they want is to do identity politics. But for white men this time. They want young, male, white faces willing to toe the Democratic Party line. They want an Andrew Tate who, when he opens his mouth, merciless neoliberalism spills out instead of misogyny. That's what they want, and that's not what David Hogg is about.
And DNC Vice Chairman David Hogg has an idea of how to channel it. In an unprecedented move, as the DNC does not typically get involved in primaries, Hogg announced that a separate organization where he serves as president, called Leaders We Serve, is going to intervene in solidly Democratic districts as part of a $20 million effort to elect younger leaders and unseat their party's older lawmakers. Hogg telling The Times, people say they want change in the Democratic Party, but really they want change so long as it doesn't potentially endanger their position of power. The man in question joins me now.
So, I'm sorry. I do not even believe that Democrats are even wanting to win over young men. I don't even believe their stated goal. I have been watching this Democratic grift for far too long at this point. This whole story about the Democrats spending $20 million to study how to win over white men and create a liberal Joe Rogan, I don't even believe it. The most likely goal of that entire ordeal is probably just a scheme for Democrats to funnel $20 million in DNC donations to their consulting friends. You cannot tell me that the Democrats are sincerely, in good faith, trying to figure out how to win the votes of young men while literally removing them from positions of party leadership using dirty, rotten, rat method, backdoor procedures like they're currently doing. I see it for exactly what it is. It's liberal, Democrat grifting. Democratic leaders want to convince and assure the donor class and their voters that they're working tirelessly to learn from their 2024 loss. They have to do this in order to keep the donations coming in. It's no different than when you try to look busy when your boss passes by your desk. Any liberal who falls for this grift honestly deserves it at this point.